Welcome to Ecclesia Principles, a biblical strategy for believers to engage in God's design for government with Ray Eppard.
Hello, glad you could join us again today. We're going to continue talking about what I call the Ecclesia principle of balancing self-government and centralization. Now, in talking about this last week, we kind of laid a foundation for things. We saw that God in Genesis 1:26 gave to Adam, and Adam alone at that point in time, dominion over the earth. If you would, he established self-government. Self-government is the basis of everything that functions here on this planet. It is to be the basis of all government and everything like that. But God did make Eve, and then we see in verse 28 where God said he gave them dominion. So it was just first Adam, but then it was Adam and Eve, and they both had dominion. Now, in Genesis 2:15, God told Adam to tend and keep the garden, or as some more newer translations say, cultivate and protect the garden. The garden was if you would, a small part of the whole earth. If you look at the beginning of Genesis chapter 2, it basically tells us that Eden was the only place that there was vegetation, because it actually says that no plants had grown in the earth. Therefore, God planted a garden eastward in Eden. And he told Adam to cultivate and to protect the garden. Now, the protecting of the garden would have been keeping out the devil, keeping Satan out, keeping Lucifer out. In other words, it was a God-honoring culture. At that point, he was supposed to keep it that way, but he was supposed to cultivate it. So often when people look at the phrase when God told them to be fruitful and multiply, they just think of having children. Well, Adam was supposed to take that small section of land, and by that I'm not saying it was like a half an acre or anything like that, no, percentage-wise of the earth. He was supposed to take that small piece of earth and expand it throughout the world. He was to cultivate it. He was to fill the earth, replenish the earth with a garden that God had given him. Now, with that though, we began to track the development of centralization. And I just want to do some reviewing here before we start going further. But we saw that in Genesis, the early part of Genesis, we start seeing, especially in some of the genealogies, it starts listing those who developed bronze and iron. It lists those who developed stringed and wood and wind instruments. It talks about those who made tents and who domesticated animals. At that point, what that is identifying is centralization. In other words, you can't develop a stringed instrument. Now, let's go back. They had zero musical instruments. They had to figure out how it would make the sound, how to make it, the wind instruments, all of that. They began to do that, which took time. And they spent extra time doing that. And it says basically that it was several people's families that one developed this one, another developed that one, another developed this one. In other words, they spent their extra time cultivating wind instruments, stringed instruments, bronze, iron, developing, cultivating, domesticating animals, making tents. Those types of things they developed. And with that, over time, they would develop more, and we get to where, hey, I need to buy some buy some vegetables off of you. I need to get some meat from you. And at that point, that's where the bartering system would eventually come in as centralization increased. You cannot have specialization without centralization. In other words, you cannot have everyone being a jack of all trades everyone basically being self-sufficient and also develop brain surgery. You can't do it. Somebody's going to have to spend their time just studying brain surgery. They're not going to have the time to go out and do these other things. They're going to have to spend time on this. That is a specialization. And in order for them to be able to do that, there has to be a collective. Basically, it's the beginning of the forming of cities. There has to be a collective where, this person over here, they grow this particular crop, this particular vegetable. This one grows something else. This one over here grows livestock. This one over here has a dairy. They milk the cows. They make cheese. They do all these types of things. And then they come together and they sell it, buy and sell. And that is the beginning of centralization. It's the development of cities. Now, a lot of people think that God just wanted a garden. God made a garden. God didn't make a city. Yeah, but we saw in Hebrews chapter 11 that Abraham, after God talked to him, it said he was looking for a city whose builder and maker was God. God didn't talk to Abraham about a garden. He talked to him about a city. In other words, God was wanting humanity to develop centralization. And we'll skip ahead. In Revelation chapter 21, we see that in the new heaven and the new earth, there is a new Jerusalem that we'll all live in. And there it says that the nations bring their glory and their honor into there and basically present it to Jesus. Now, what that ultimately is saying is that the nations, the things that they cultivate, the things that they develop, they will bring it into the city to show it off to the king. So again, it is a development of centralization. We're going to live in that city. Now that city, if you look at chapter 22, you'll see it's got a major river running through it. If you would, it has a park, a huge, massive park. It's got the river of life. It's got the tree of life all down the banks of it. And there's a lot there. It's a huge, massive city. 1,500 miles square, if you would, the Bible tells us. It's big. It's big. It's got a garden in it. Probably has a few gardens in it. But it's a city. And if you would, God wants a balance between self-government and centralization. Now, with this, and I want to start talking about some of the problems. Because I said last week that a lot of the tensions and a lot of the difficulties that we have in our culture right now are the result of this tension between self-government and centralization, and that we have to understand the proper approach to that. So today I'm going to get into a couple things, and throughout the course of this week, I'm going to use different examples of what that tension looks like in topical fashion. Now, I want to use Romans 7:17 as a text for some of this. And it might seem a little strange off the top, but as we get into it, I think you'll understand why I'm wanting to use this passage. Paul is really talking about the condition of humanity. And in verse 17, he says, "But now it is no longer I that do it or who do it." In other words, he's saying, well, what I really want to do, I don't end up doing that. And what I don't want to do, I end up doing that. In other words, I have this struggle that I'm facing. And he says, but now it is no longer I who do it, but sin that dwells in me. The reason I want to use this verse is because to me, this is one of the best verses to identify that we all have a fallen nature. when Adam sinned, when he ate of the fruit of the tree, then death entered his heart, his spirit. And in dying, he ended up dying physically. The day he ate of the tree, he died on the inside. His outside, the body, died 930 some years later. But in between there, he had this sin nature. That sin nature in our flesh is what makes us want to do the things that we don't really want to do. Our heart doesn't want to do them. Our mind tells us that we shouldn't do it. And then here we go. And we did it. And some people, well, the devil made me do it. No, it wasn't the devil made you do it. You did it. You did it. It was that sin nature that you yielded to in that situation. You say, well, what does this have to do with self-government and centralization? Well, you see, and I'm going to deal with this primarily on the side of centralization, because a big part of the struggle that we deal with today in our culture is, especially as we have a growing population. And with that, then the things that are centralized are even bigger. You think back a number of years ago, and you had the mom and pop shops. You had the family owned this store and another family owned that store over there. And that was pretty much the case in towns and cities throughout our country. But today we have a little different dynamic. A lot of the mom and pops are gone. And if you would, they're gone because of that tension between centralization and self-government. The mom and pop was the self-government. The centralization is the big box stores, if you would. But you see, there's certain advantages to the big box stores. And again, I just ask, don't get offended, just listen to what I'm saying. There's certain advantages to that. When you have repetition, when you buy in volume, you're able to drive the price down. In self-government, the mom and pop shop, well, there you can't buy in that large of a volume. You can't stock but so much. And so those dynamics, you begin to create a situation where, especially when there are times that are difficult financially, people will choose to buy the lower price. If it's the same object, same item, they will buy the lower priced that comes from centralization, as opposed to the higher priced, same product that comes from self-government or the mom and pop. And so as a result of that, the big box stores, the centralization becomes even more powerful. And more power is located inside of those companies. Now, the problem is everybody has a sin nature. And so with that, those increased powers can be turned for evil. They can be done to actually do away with self-government, to eliminate the competition. And there needs to be a balance so that this has to be protected without destroying the centralization. Well, we're out of time, but join us again tomorrow and we'll continue this. God bless you.